Great. Welcome everyone to this webinar on supporting meaningful interactions in early childhood education and care in the United States. This webinar is co-hosted by the Learning Policy Institute, OECD, and the National Institute for Early Education Research. I'm Hannah Melnick, Senior Policy Advisor at the Learning Policy Institute, where I co-lead our early learning team. And today's webinar is about identifying policies that can support really rich interactions between caregivers, children, and their families. I'm going to start today with opening remarks about the US context. Then we'll have a presentation of OECD's recent study of how policies can support meaningful interactions in other countries, given by Andreas Schleiser of OECD. And then we're going to have a panel discussion and Q&A that follows with these findings in the US context, where we'll be joined by Barbara Cooper, Secretary of Early Childhood Education in Alabama, and Steve Barnett, Senior Co-Director of NEAR. Please feel free to drop in questions at any time into the Q&A, and I'm going to try my best to integrate those into the panel discussion. So research shows that the quality of interactions that children have with adults and their peers in early childhood is incredibly important for academic and life success. These interactions are often called process quality. In practice, it looks like children talking and reading and singing and having meaningful conversations with their teachers, with their friends in their early childhood environments. That's what I look for when I look for care for my own two kids. And that's what research shows is really important for outcomes. Unfortunately, research on interactions in the US and ECE programs shows a few concerning trends. One is just that instructional quality overall is low, although emotional support is generally high. And the second is that children, the quality varies with the family income that children have. So children from families with the lowest incomes experience the lowest quality care on average. And finally, interactions vary within programs and classrooms. So even in the same class, children may not have the same experience as their peers. For example, children of color receiving more exclusionary discipline than their white peers. So these are huge, have huge implications for equity, but we are at a historic moment right now in the United States where we have a chance to change some of these trends in the United States. There is unprecedented attention on childcare due to the pandemic, and that has led to funding and policy from Congress, the administration, and states. It's so needed because, at least in terms of access, we have just a half of our 3- and 4-year-olds in this country in preschool. Just a fraction of infants and toddlers have access to childcare. And these are trends that have been exacerbated by the pandemic. But as we expand access, we really need to consider what are the policies that are also going to ensure that children have meaningful interactions in these programs. Policy is complex to change in early childhood because children learn in many different settings and programs, both public and private. We have quality standards for many of these programs, but they vary widely from teachers' qualifications to class sizes and ratios. Most states have curricular frameworks that they use at least for preschool, but programs are not always required to even use the curriculum that follows that framework. And furthermore, educators are often not given the support that they need to implement them well. They get little professional development that's often on nights and weekends, often get little paid planning time. And frankly, most early educators are just not compensated at a level that reflects the complexity and importance of the work that they do. Most states do have quality rating and improvement systems that are designed to support quality, but these systems are often voluntary, and they're only going to be helpful insofar as they provide the resources that educators need to support and inform their practice. So In this context, after years of disinvestment in the US in early care and education, there is so much we can learn from other countries who have been forging ahead. So that's why I'm really excited for this study that's about to be presented and our panel discussion. So right now I'm going to pass it to Andreas Schleiser, OECD Director for Education and Skills, who's going to be presenting important research on policies from other countries that can help support process quality beyond regulations. And a link to the report will be in the chat for you to check out, and it'll be shared at the end of our presentation as well. Andreas?
Thanks so much, Hannah, and thanks for your interest all in the launch of our latest edition in the series Starting Strong, a series that we actually started almost 20 years ago. So it's a long-standing area of research, the area of early childhood education. And for many years, we focused on access. Is early childhood education a care accessible to all children? Is it affordable? And you can see enormous progress has been made on this over the last decades. Now, if you see, for example, where countries like Poland and the Russian Federation stood, around 2005, when we began tracking this, you could see less than 40% of 3 to 5-year-old children were enrolled in this days. And today, even in those countries, it's now well over 80%. So you can see access and affordability have materialized in many countries of the OECD. So the discussion, as you just highlighted, Hannah, is now shifting. How can we move from access to quality, from care to genuine learning experiences? And obviously, this is where public policy plays such an important role. And this is really what the latest edition of Starting Strong is about. Why do we pay so much attention to quality? Because data from longitudinal surveys show that emergent literacy, but not just cognitive skills, also self-regulation and so on, are very powerful predictor for success, not just in the transition to schooling, but also to success later in life, economically, socially. That's the story, really. I think the earliest years are the strong foundation for our success later in life. Some of the knowledge and skills that we value most at work today, can you live with yourself? Can you live with others? Actually, some of those skills are learned best in the earliest years of life. We also have data from the United States, and you will be familiar with them, longitudinal data as well, where they studied the effects of programs that were targeted at students in disadvantage. And also here, you can see those programs that often have a strong focus on children's cognitive and social emotional development. They are powerful predictors, not just in schooling, actually a little bit less in schooling than you might expect, but certainly later in adulthood when you look at the earnings differentials that are associated with this. So those are the reasons why the early years are very, very important. And not just in terms of, again, access participation, but in terms of the experience. So this is what you can see in this latest study. When you think about policy, you might think that is far away from what happens at the front line. When you bring your child to kindergarten, you may not think about policy right from the start. But actually, if you think about it a second time, policy sets the frame for what the curriculum is about. Now, the priority of what actually happens in the settings, what happens during the day. It sets the standards for the teacher education, qualifications, for monitoring, for the organization and work, and also how teachers relate to families and communities. In the schooling sector, there are so many things we take for granted. We take for granted that children learn something that is meaningful, that is carefully, written into a curricula. We take for granted that teachers are highly qualified, that they're reasonably well paid, that they continue their education. We take for granted that the work is organized in reliable, predictable settings that are reasonably coherent. And we take for granted that all of this is paid for by the public purse. And nobody would question those things when it comes to schooling. Well, when you think about the early years, almost none of this can be taken for granted. So public policy is really important. When we think about policy in the early years at the OECD, we look at several aspects. Obviously, governance, how our systems run, what's the role of the federal, the regional, the local, the center-based kind of responsibilities. We look at standards and funding. We look at curriculum and pedagogy. We look at workforce development. We look at evidence, data monitoring, and family and community engagement. Those are the broad policy areas that are important to us. And this report focuses on two of them, the content, curriculum and pedagogy, and then how we support people to deliver that content, workforce development. And that's basically what I'm going to talk about. And I also I'm going to just, scratch the surface in my presentation, but I want to refer you to our website. If you're interested in the data from particular jurisdictions, you can actually drill down quite deeply in the responses that we got from them and get a lot of really good insights from this database. In many countries, the organization of early childhood education and care is quite complex. Responsibility are often, widely distributed, usually at subnational levels, like in the United States. So we had to, make some choices to enable meaningful comparisons. One is to look at comparable age bands. Basically, we look at the age groups 0 to 2 and then 3 to 5, sometimes combined with primary school. That's a choice that we make to allow for good international comparisons. It captures basically all countries in the types of organization of the sector, even though in the specific age groups then might vary. So let's start. Let's start with the big what question. Now, what is actually being learned? How do we shape that through curriculum framework? Now, curriculum frameworks really define early childhood education and care in terms of its goals, in terms of the learning and development content, the type of activities that you're going to see in children's development, in their learning, in their well-being. So curriculum frameworks really set out the what question. And that's also often how they are conceptualized, often, reaching into far more dimensions than just the learning content that you'll see in school. And obviously, the written curriculum is just a starting point. The implemented curriculum, what actually happens at the front line, is much more influential. So we look at the specifications relating to this as well, how it shapes the quality of the interactions between children and staff. What we found is that curricula are more likely to be mandatory for children aged 3 to 5 than for those the youngest one, 0 to 2 groups. That may sound familiar to you, but it's not obvious at all, and it's not natural at all. In one way, you could say for older children, actually, it's much more obvious what you would teach and what you learn. For the youngest children, actually, this is where you need to work hardest to get the research evidence to educators at the front line, but it doesn't happen so often. The reason is that too often, the earliest years are still framed in a kind of care paradigm where the learning is secondary. And that's something I think many education systems are now starting to tackle, to look at, curriculum frameworks that extend to the youngest age. As you can see in the chart here, most participating countries for which we have data specify the developmental and learning goals using combinations of, first of all, broad concepts or competency, communicating, developing curiosity, and so on. That's the dark brown part, and you can see that particularly prominent for the youngest children. And then, values and principles. That could be things like respect, like equity, like opportunity for play. That's the light brown part, also more common among the youngest children. And then traditional learning areas, the arts, the sciences that are marked here in green and blue in the pie chart. So as you move from the left to the right, from the younger to the older groups, you can see the charts becoming more green and blue. Now, so for older age groups, traditional learning areas are becoming more commonplace. And that's natural because that's where the link to schooling becomes more relevant. So you can see that focus here. What really matters is the deliberate thinking that is behind the design of these curricula in ways that reflect what we know about the development of children. Now, this is not just about, pushing down what's happening in school to see how we can prepare for that, but there's increasing evidence in countries to look at what does neuroscience, what does research actually tell us is learned best at what ages, and then to design a learning experience around this in a developmental trajectory. So we found this really interesting to see the efforts that are being made across countries. Now, the curriculum is a starting point, but what makes the difference is ultimately how the curriculum is enacted by the staff, by the people, put into action. And what is clear is that the curriculum goals can be attained through very different pedagogical approaches, staff practices, but also values and beliefs. And what you can see here in the chart is that views on what pedagogies are most effective for what age group and for what target group really vary widely. I would even say that there's no consensus even among researchers on what pedagogies serve what purpose best. There's a lot of variability, and certainly a lot of variability in curricula. You can see, for example, here constructivist, interactive pedagogies are quite prominent for all age groups, also social pedagogy, developmental appropriate practices, experiential education. And then when you get towards older children, you can see how didactic, direct instruction and readiness for school become more important. That's sort of a broad trend, but once again, a lot of variability, and part of that variability is simply that we do not yet know sufficiently what works best for what age group. So that's the broad picture that emerges, but again, on our interactive database, you'll find a lot of interesting detail how this plays out and what pedagogical choices are made by what system. Very interesting to see how this varies. Very important is also that curriculum frameworks need to adapt to different stakeholder needs, to different local contexts, to different children needs. That's the challenge often. You have a framework, but then you need to make it work for the people you are serving. And one way of doing this is to involve stakeholders in design. I would even go as far as, where we do not involve stakeholders in the design of curricula, they are going to rarely help you with implementation because they don't feel that ownership. So actually, stakeholder engagement in curriculum design, we have found to be one of the most powerful levers to actually ensure that the curriculum is effectively delivered. What you can see here on the chart is, as you would imagine, government agencies are the most dominant source involved in the development of curriculum frameworks. And then on the right side, you can see parent and community groups are sort of less frequently included. Now that's only in about 30 out of 56 curricula that we studied. And in fact, the least commonly included category is children. Only 10 out of 56 curricula involve children in the design process. And you might say, well, that's obvious. How can you ask, 3 or 4 or 5-year-olds about curriculum? But actually, I encourage you to look at the study. You can see, for example, in Flanders, in the Flemish community of Belgium, in Estonia, in Ireland, in New Zealand, they use very interesting approaches to directly relate to children and see and observe how they learn best and translate this into curriculum design. And simply, we shouldn't just assume just because children are small, they cannot articulate themselves. Actually, if we are creative enough, we can actually see how children can be quite good in articulating their needs, and we can build that into curriculum. Good examples on this. Another topic is how do we observe quality, monitoring and evaluation of early childhood education and care policies can really be a very powerful lever to develop and ensure quality. And it's not just about, accountability or control. Actually, the big issue really here is to use good information to help stakeholders at the front line to become better at their job. That's how monitoring and evaluation are at their best in the early years. you can see to what extent the kind of broad ideas in the curriculum are well implemented, fulfill their goals, deliver the outcomes expected from everyone. And obviously, those systems need to be very closely linked to quality support systems so that staff feel, well, I learn where I can become better, and then I have access to opportunities to improve my skills. So the inner relationships between monitoring and actually staff development are very important. We studied those kinds of examples. What is quite concerning when you look at this chart is that we seem to be doing quite a bit when it comes to older children, 3 to 5 year olds. You can see at least once a year, a lot of systems doing that. But for the youngest children, again, that's where evaluation is almost absent. And I would actually argue you would want to see the picture the opposite way. You would want to see that the least structured part of the system that deals with the youngest children has the best tools to actually observe and monitor quality. So I think a lot of jurisdictions, as you can see, have a long way to go to actually ensure that there are good evaluation mechanisms in place, including for the very youngest children. Now, how often you monitor curriculum is one thing. How that is done and what exactly is covered is obviously at least as important. And also, it's important to ensure that the scope of monitoring really concerns all aspects of process quality. And the reason I say this is because often people pay attention to what you somehow make visible, what you measure. And if only some aspects of process quality are covered, you risk that activities get distorted towards this. So comprehensive approach to this is really something that we find very important. And you can also see here how this is playing out in different ways. Now, interactions between staff and children are monitored in the majority of curricula. Now, that's the most first thing you would look at. How do staff and children interact? 34 out of 56 jurisdictions do something about it. Many curricula say how important it is to engage parents and families, but you look at the data here, only 37% actually monitor interactions between staff and parents. So there's a clear gap between what we judge to be important and what is actually taken into account into the monitoring framework. And the least monitored interactions are between children and parents and children and communities. But obviously what you can see here are averages. There's a lot of variability across countries. This is just an overall trend that I'm highlighting here. Now, you can always write a beautiful curriculum and monitor its effectiveness, but how do we actually prepare staff for effective curriculum implementation? It's also a point that you highlighted, Hannah. It is really important for initial education and professional development to provide good opportunities and also good guidance to all staff to understand and interpret the relationship between curriculum and pedagogy in early childhood education. In case not something you can take for granted. Now, how do I actually translate those curricular goals into good pedagogical practices? That really requires a lot of support, a lot of training. And what you can see here is that across the participating countries, curriculum framework implementation in initial education programs is largely required for teachers for all age groups. That's good. That's, the dark blue segment. But you do see that there's still some of the jurisdictions where that is not the case, where this is not regulated or required, the orange part, or where it simply happens, but it's not part of the system. That's the light blue part. So again, I think there's more that systems can do to ensure that that link between professional development and curriculum is more clearly articulated and consistently implemented. Now, this is very obvious. The written curriculum will only be as good as the training that is provided to the staff to actually implement it. We know about the power of work-based learning for all professionals. Now, life is always a great teacher. And work-based learning during initial education for early childhood education and care staff is often also associated with high-quality early childhood education. Basically ensuring that people are not just going to an academic program, but they experience the work with children. Now, you go to a university with a very different mindset. If you have actually practical experience at the front line, and work-based learning is a good way to combine theory and practice, and supporting also those skills that are really at the core of early childhood education and care. And this is less about knowledge transmission. This is more about interaction. And those things are often hard to teach, but easy to observe and easier to emulate. So the possibility to observe teacher-child interactions within real-life situations is actually very, very important to foster rich interactions with children in practice. So we studied whether such a practicum is required content of initial teacher training. And what you can see here is that it is the case in many settings when it comes to 3 to 5 year olds, now over 70%, but only in about 60% for the youngest children. Now, again, there's no logic behind this. The only reason is often that, well, it has a care tradition and you think, well, anybody can do that. Whereas the educational part should be given as much attention. But you can see over 40% of systems do not, do that on a regular basis. What's also quite, striking is how big the gap is between teachers and assistants. Now, assistants often play a very important role in the early childhood education settings, but you can see for assistants, it's actually quite rare to get that kind of practical experience. So things to worry about, to think about. And of course, professional development can be a very, very important ingredient also to foster process quality. In our study, we found that several countries have requirements for participation in professional development, but actually most countries do not regulate the monitoring of quality for professional development. Again, it may read to you as normal, but in school, we would never dream that. We would actually always be very, very conscious of regulating that kind of professional quality. Also, we found that barriers to participation are not systematically studied, so we do not know why people do not attend certain kind of training courses and so on. There's a lot I think we can do better. And we actually do a special study on this, a survey of teaching as part of the TALIS survey, where we look into those things in greater detail. Last but not least, early childhood education and staff do not just work with children. Actually, they do a lot of other things as well, and they need to do a lot of other things in order to provide the best education. For example, individual planning or preparing play and learning activities, working with colleagues, working with parents. All of that is very important, and the work organization really needs to provide the space for that. So one of the things that we ask ourselves is, to what extent is that built into the work organization of educators? Not just, I do that because it's my job. No, but to what extent do we actually, build that into the work organization and time allocation? And you can say there's a lot of gaps here. Now, you can basically across all of the activities, whether you talk about individual planning or preparing, collaboration and speaking with colleagues and parents, documenting children's development, attending professional development, reflecting on work. Now, all of those bars rarely exceed half of the systems. So you can see actually in many education systems, early childhood education and care systems, this is maybe happening, but it's not really systematically built into this. And that I do believe is an area we should, look into very carefully to ensure that the kind of activities that staff do are not just, the transaction and the work with the children, but actually engage also the system as a whole and the continued professional development of people. So what can I say in conclusion? Ensuring children's holistic development through curriculum frameworks that extend through all ages, cover all parts of the sectors, are carefully integrated, is an important ingredient of process quality. It's important to increase the quality standards of initial education for all categories of early childhood education and staff. ensuring that there is a sufficient work-based learning component like the practicum, ensuring requirements that include curriculum framework implementation, also accreditation mechanisms. Now, all of that is part of the quality agenda, supporting participation in high quality professional development. And so it's not just, allowing for it, but also removing some of the barriers and reasons, and ultimately also protecting time for other things than working with children to ensure this. And it's about, striking a good balance with this, but ultimately you can see many jurisdictions that are actually well on their way to providing all children, not just with access to affordable care and education, but also with a high quality learning environment. And once again, that is the best environment, the best investment that we can make in the future of our societies. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Andreas, for that presentation. We are now going to turn to our panel to discuss these findings and some of these key policy pointers, as you noted, Andres, in the US context, because we are in a moment where our ECE system is poised to change. So we are lucky to be joined today by Steve Barnett, Board of Governors Professor and Senior Co-Director of the National Institute for Early Education Research, and Barbara J. Cooper, Secretary of Early Childhood Education at the Alabama Department of Early Childhood Education. And Alabama has a really excellent high quality preschool program that we'll learn more about. So Andreas, Steve, I'll direct the first question to you. Andreas presented several policies that could support process quality. What do you think are the necessary preconditions to putting some of these policies in place in the US that we really need to be thinking about as we expand access?
I'd say the first thing is this is right on target. The things that Andreas talked about are exactly where we refocused the benchmarks in our review of state preschool programs a couple of years ago. And if people want to go to the 2018 State of Preschool Yearbook at near.org, they can see how each state stacks up on many of these things that Andreas talked about, and we're far behind. Why we're far behind, I think, goes to that preconditions question, because we're in a kind of trap based on funding. The funding is simply not adequate to support access to quality. How bad is this problem? There are 18 states that spend less than $1,000 per child, per low-income child at 3 and 4 for their pre-K programs, less than $1,000. There are 35 that spend less than $3,000 per low-income 3 and 4-year-old for preschool. So quality is not in the picture, right, in terms of workforce development and a workforce that could implement high-quality curriculum, much less the capacity to support that. And that's why I think this new federal opportunity is so crucial, because it opens the door for substantial increases in funding that would allow states to build the capacity to implement this at scale. And right now, states have to basically, with I should say, New Jersey, Vermont, and DC have enough money to do this, allocated in their state budgets. The rest of the states do not. So they have to choose. Do we serve fewer kids, or do we put quality in front? And of course, right now, I think the answer to that is serve fewer kids and put quality in front until you have the money.
It's so true. I mean, those are really shocking figures. And I think the challenge is where you are as a state leader, how do you react to some of these trade-offs? So Barbara, I'd like to ask you as a state leader, what are some of the challenges and opportunities you've identified in supporting meaningful interactions? And particularly thinking about how we will do so as we emerge from the COVID-19 pandemic, during which both children and caregivers have really experienced significant trauma.
Thank you, Hannah. And I certainly can concur with what Steve as well as Andreas have shared around process quality. And the pandemic definitely provided an opportunity for us as a state to really focus on our work at the ADEC. As indicated, we have a strong 4-year-old program, but the pandemic has allowed us to really take a look at our entire birth through 5 systems, and we're doing some things through the PDGB 5 grant, as well as our department is now over QRIS to really look at that entire birth to 5 continuum. Fortunately, we have policies that actually address those 4 policy levers that we've been talking about. We do have Alabama Standards for Early Learning Development that really help to focus teachers' work around what children need to be doing and what's developmentally appropriate at each of those stages of a child's development. We have extensive supports for our educator workforce in that we actually provide professional learning, 30 hours of job dedicated professional development for our lead teachers and 20 hours of professional development for our auxiliary teacher. And all of our pre-K classrooms have both a lead and auxiliary teacher. So we have a place where we can build on some of this process quality. Of course, it's wonderful to have standards. However, in addition to those standards, most of our areas choose their curriculum. So we are really working around how we can better support multiple curricula across our state. Of course, we have guidelines and recommendations for curricula, but again, the more expansive you get in what the locals can utilize for curriculum, the more watered down in terms of what we're able to do as a state and provide that support. I think one of the supports that we have that's really what we kind of coin as our secret sauce is the coaching model that we have in Alabama. We have the Alabama Reflective Coaching Model that really allows us to focus on job embedded professional learning for those teachers. And so because that coach is there and able to have dedicated time to work with the lead and auxiliary teacher, they're able to really focus on interactions and give the teacher immediate feedback around what they're observing and build plans for how they can continue to support that teacher in ways that are meaningful for not only the classroom, but definitely for that child and to help that child build. Andreas spoke about the opportunity to really interact with parents. I don't know that we have models where we actually have continuous quality improvement around that particular area. Of course, we have requirements for interacting with parents, but as far as really digging deeply to determine how effective that interaction between the teacher and the parent is, and the parent and the child is, those are areas that we certainly want to continue to grow around. The pandemic also presented opportunity for us to just really look at how we're addressing the trauma that many of our children have experienced, are prepared to work with children who are coming from these disadvantaged circumstances and have experienced adverse childhood experiences that now impact what's happening in the classroom. Again, the pandemic has just provided an opportunity for us to really reflect. We did do a survey of our teachers to find out what they needed the greatest support around. And interestingly enough, it was around curriculum. And we provided the creative cloud curriculum for them, particularly during the pandemic, and are finding that more of them are actually wanting to continue implementing that as they move into the reopening phase and providing opportunities for children and families. So it tells us that there was a benefit to having this consistency in delivery of curriculum across the board for our entire state.
Thank you for that. And I want to pick up on some of the coaching and the models that you discussed in a little bit. But until then, I think one thing you mentioned, Barbara, is just how the challenge of having all of these locally developed or used curricula, and then the importance of making sure that they're well implemented. Andreas, and this is a question from Stephanie in the chat. Can you tell us a little bit about how some of the how curricula can reflect the social and cultural contexts of children and families, what changes need to be made at the local level, if you've seen anything about how that can be, how local curricula can be supported by countries or states.
Yeah, Hannah, this is a very important point. That's why we don't talk usually about curricula, one thing that you use everywhere, but about curriculum frameworks, basically, where we actually spell out the adaptation and localization that is required in the settings. And obviously it does require capacity. That's why the training component comes in that also Barbara just highlighted. It does need staff who are capable to interpret the curriculum framework and can translate it into settings and actions that then are appropriate for the children they serve. That is particularly important in the early years. It's not just cultural context, but this is also about different communities, different socioeconomic contexts. So I think that localization capacity is something very important. There are some very good models across this in the study. If you look, for example, to the Estonian example, where and they have actually even lots of minorities in the country, and do provide a framework that then provides a lot of guidance for actually local adaptation. Let me also sort of make a little bit, a comment on the resourcing issue that Steve highlighted. I very much agree with this. That's something that is reflected in our numbers. But when it comes to money, I don't feel so much pity with the United States. It's a high spending country overall, and what you do not invest in the early years, you will spend many times in schooling and beyond. And actually, that's exactly what the data show for the United States, that education becomes excessively expensive when people get older. Whereas, the savings are made where actually they have the, by large margin, the highest returns. And there's a second component to this. When resources are limited, many countries have, funding formulas in place that ensure that the money is spent where it can make most of a difference. Now, once again, if you come from a wealthy background, you're going to find many open doors in life and many good early childhood education opportunities. Where you come from a disadvantaged background, you just have one single card to play in your life, and that is a good education. So once again, funding formulas that reflect the money that institutions get based on the kind of socioeconomic intake. There are lots of really good recipes in place across the world where even limited funding can get you a long way.
Thank you. Yeah, so I think just picking up on some of these themes that we need to have the funding in place to support our educators. Steve, what do you think states can do to help early educators really be well prepared to support high quality interactions, implement a curriculum? What are the PD levers that we have?
This is a difficult problem, as Barbara mentioned. Virtually all the states have good early learning standards, early learning and teaching standards. A lot of them are birth to 5, they're aligned with K-12. And then when you move to the curriculum piece, you see that they have maybe a list of 10 different ones or more. Very few states have, a handful of states have a list as short as 3 or 4 options. And as far as I know, New Jersey is the only state that requires a district to have one curriculum, even for 3 and 4-year-olds, much less birth to 5. And these curricula I would call frameworks, right? And so it's very difficult to think about how do you support in higher education a system where you have no idea what the curriculum framework will be that teachers will encounter. How do you prepare them for everything? How do you, and this goes to the professional development. How do you provide professional development? In New Jersey, our decision was made on the grounds that we did not think it was feasible to provide high quality professional development that was coherent, to build capacity over time for truly expert teachers, if every program was going to have a different curriculum, much less to try to somehow align that with what was going on in kindergarten. right? So in New Jersey, you can go online, you can see teachers online first thing in the morning in some school districts doing professional development they've created for themselves about how to do particular activities. So they're molding, developing, creating the curriculum, teaching each other, but they have a single framework, right? That is so rare anywhere else in the country that I'm not sure how we ever get to a strong level of professional development. And that's one of the reasons we have so much emphasis on job embedded coaching, because it's individualized to the teacher in that teacher's classroom, that teacher's specific needs. And that all makes a lot of sense. But when you have to do this differently for, because there could be 12 different models that are being used in one school district, and that's before you even get to birth to two. And then, of course, this is tied in with the basic preparation of our teachers and our assistants. And so there's been a battle in one state, which I won't name, not represented here, I will say that, because the childcare community has rejected and is fighting against a requirement to do developmental screenings, because they're saying our teachers can't competently do developmental screenings. It is beyond their capabilities. Well, if they can't do a simple screening for child development, then I don't see how they can implement a high quality educational program for children birth to 5. And the end, they're basically arguing they haven't been prepared for that. And you see this over and over in quality rating improvement systems, where the systems measure overall quality of program, but when you look at what's being done in professional development, it's focused on health and safety. And again, often the argument is because our teachers are not capable of more demanding professional development. And that goes back to, well, we're not adequately paying people to come in and stay in the field and develop the professional capabilities that we'd like them to have. So it's all a package. It's very difficult to take any of these. You take any one piece out and the others start to fall apart.
Right. Well, I think one thing you picked up on is just the importance of, given the diversity of the field and the settings, the importance of job embedded supports. And so, Barbara, I'd love for you to share a little bit about what Alabama is doing to address professional development through job embedded coaching, how that's structured and how that supports educators.
Well, our Alabama reflective coaching model gives us an opportunity, as you've indicated, to provide that job embedded support for teachers. Basically, our coaches are trained, and based on the information that they have, they work directly with their coaching load. So each of those coaches have a load of anywhere between 20 and 25 teachers that they're responsible for supporting. They go into those classrooms several times a month and work one-on-one with those teachers, both the lead teacher and the auxiliary teacher, to determine where the challenges are and how they can best support that teacher. Our coaches also do reflective supervision among coaches, where they come together weekly and have those conversations about the challenges that they are seeing out in the field. We use that information to help inform what we need to be doing as a state. Of course, this has been especially challenging during the pandemic, where we have had many challenges that coaches had not had to deal with before, among them including trying to provide remote learning for children. We were dealing with that particular situation. But all of this information is used to help us improve our processes. We are trying to become more deliberate around the data that we receive from each of our various assessment tools, teaching strategies, goal that everyone is required to use, as well as the results from class. We're trying to look at these results from a statewide level to determine what professional learning is needed for the entire field, as well as what coaches need to do individually as they're working with those teachers through this job embedded reflective coaching model. We've also been doing quite a bit of work with Leading for Children to help us become, we're using the Optimistic Leadership Network to better view everyone as a leader of their own learning and bring teachers together with the coaches and with our state leadership to really determine what's the best way to guide this work as we continue to move forward. Again, with us having multiple ways that we provide curriculum out in our local areas, we recognize that this is an area that we need to determine best how we use state dollars to really fund what is needed to best move the levers in those classrooms.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions in the chat right now about how since curricular frameworks are just kind of, as they're called, a framework, how do we support educators to meet the needs of linguistically diverse children and families, and how to support family engagement? Andreas, I'm wondering if you might be able to share some of the examples that you've seen for how this is done.
Well, on the linguistic part, that's actually a very common challenge across countries. I think many countries have, multiple languages, multiple dialects, multiple cultures they need to serve. And again, the curriculum framework should cover all of that. It should provide actually good guidance on how to adapt and localize the curriculum to different cultural and language groups. And that's typically what you see. That's the easy part, obviously. The harder part is, again, to train staff to be able to sort of do that for different children. And I think supporting languages is one of the toughest challenges, because that's precisely what you do learn in those early years. Now, this is something to recognize those linguistic diversity and support it. But it's a very common challenge. We don't study that in particularly in this report, but there's a lot of information from the OECD on that topic. We have also studied that for indigenous groups in some countries, minority groups, a lot of really good experiences to learn from.
Mm-hmm. Steve, what do you see as some of the key policy levers for supporting dual language learners, and particularly in the higher ed gaps that you've identified?
I think that the first is a recognition in your policy of its importance, and having dual language, multi-language goals for our programs, and it has to be connected to K-12, right? And even where we have good dual language models, for example, they may not be continued in academic language development up through K-12. So that's the start, creating the pipeline for the leaders and teachers who have the linguistic and cultural capabilities themselves. Incorporating that into our higher education programs, incorporating it in our professional development. Those two things we probably are better at than ensuring that we're building the workforce more generally that has these capabilities and investing in them. So I think that. And that goes, I sometimes, I don't know if this is just being an economist, but it brings me back to, we need to ensure that there's adequate pay for teachers who have these capabilities. And you might think about paying them more, right? If you're dual language competent. That certainly happens in other fields. That would help build this, and building this into building leadership pipelines that ensure that this goes all the way up. And this is about developing collective capacity, which isn't only about resources, right? So that or financial resources. A lot of being able to do this isn't just putting the policies in place, but it's having the state and local, and I would argue federal capacity to support these. And to do that, you have to build the capacity and the leadership. Who would staff these? if a state wanted to have dozens or even 100 content specialists who could support programs, where would they get them? We need to invest in that kind of capacity. And actually, I think that's I would like to see this new federal opportunity go in this direction of perhaps making the funds available with very few strings. Get rid of the typical HHS micro regulation of programs that we see in something like Head Start. Trust states to do this and build the capacity at the federal level to support them, build the capacity at the state level to support local, et cetera. But if you don't have the human capacity collectively to engage in this, it really doesn't matter what's on paper.
If I may just add one aspect to this, think about this not just as a means to serve linguistic minorities. Think about this also as developing language skills among the general population. Actually, your northern neighbor Canada does that really well, which sees sort of multiple language as a window to the world, is enabling people. And the great advantage is, when we're adults, learning languages is really, really hard. When you are a 2-year-old, a 3-year-old, a 4-year-old, actually, it comes natural and it comes at no expense of your native language.
I would just quickly add to what Steve indicated around really having models that support early learning all the way through K-12. We've had conversations with our Department of Education around both of us having WIDA years for students. We have the WIDA early years, and we're really using that as a framework to support our English language learners, but K-12 also utilizes WIDA. So just trying to have some continuity around what both agencies are doing so that as children leave out of the early learning environment, they go into a K-12 environment that also uses a similar framework for supporting, instructing, and assessing language development of children.
And as Andreas pointed out, this is not just for kids whose home language is not English. Kids whose home language is English will be doing very well in our world future if they have another language as well.
Absolutely.
Strength-based models as well instead of deficit-based models when you're addressing children that have that second language. That's something great to build upon and not to be looked at as something that we need to work at from a deficit.
So I think in the last couple of minutes, Barbara, I just wanted to follow up on one of Steve's comments about just the importance of recruiting and retaining really qualified staff. What are you thinking about in the next couple of years in your developing the teacher pipeline in Alabama?
Oh my goodness, that's a perfect question, Hannah, as we will add almost 200 additional classrooms in the 2021-2022 school year. So we know that we have to continue building a workforce that is ready and prepared to teach in our early learning environments. We're being very deliberate in our conversations with higher ed around what teachers need when they walk into that early learning classroom and recognize that we have to be very intentional about what those expectations are. We're also trying to work very closer with K-12 because oftentimes our teachers, we will train them, and again, we spend 30 hours of training for our lead teachers and 20 for our auxiliary teachers, and then eventually those teachers are moved into K-12. So we want to really retain that workforce. One of the benefits in Alabama is our first class pre-K teachers are paid at the same salary as our K-12 teachers. So that allows us to be able to retain our teachers. But again, we want to be able to retain them beyond just a few years in the early learning environment, because we realize there's a certain skill set that early learning educators have that is not the same skill set that K-12 necessarily have. And I can say that because I spent over 25 years in K-12, and boy, we can do so much good if we just really focus on that birth to 5 and really make sure that that workforce understands what it means to work with children when 95% of the brain is being formed and molded into that child that's able to continue to move on to K-12 and be successful.
Absolutely. And that's such a perfect place to close because the educators are the key to having these meaningful interactions that Andreas has been speaking about earlier. I just want to say thank you so much to all three of you for these comments, and to OECD and NEAR for co-hosting this webinar with the Learning Policy Institute. I really do hope you get a chance to check out OECD's study on policies that can support meaningful interactions, early childhood care and education, which you'll find in your chat again. The slides from this presentation will, or actually there should be a link that's coming up on your screen and in the chat. The recording will be available on the same page that you'll find the report soon. We're at a turning point where we can really be thinking about how to change quality in the US. So these have some great lessons for us to learn from. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us, and I hope you have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity and great report.